everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to my talk. There's a lot of really awesome topics that are happening at Devoxx this year. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the rabbit hole that is the SVGs. They've been around for about 12 years and people still don't really use them to their full potential. If you want to Twitter at me, you can grab the hashtag with Devoxx. So this is what we're here to talk about today. This is not a GIF. This is live in the browser, all HTML with a couple CSS attributes, but that is 100% SVG, doing all of those animations, all of the color, all of the effects. It is amazing, and not enough people know about it, and not enough people utilize it within the browser. There's a codeband collection, so if you want to grab and play around with these SVGs, you're more than welcome to. Everything is on there. I'm going to be tweeting out the slides later, so you can also take some time to look at that. And if you want to take a look at the slide deck, you're also welcome to do that. There is a lot of meat and layers and layers to this lasagna, and I don't know everything about this topic. I still have been studying this forever, and there's tons of resources out there that you can utilize to learn about SVGs, but this is the part that I really, really like. So my name is Robyn. I'm a former nuclear engineer turned front-end developer. That sounds ridiculous. Happy to talk about that at a later date. I work remotely for a company called Shopify on the international growth team. This year, we took an English-only based product and launched it in 6 new languages. And when you're talking about a 12-year-old product, that is a pretty impressive thing to do. So if anybody is interested in joining internationalization, also come and talk to me. Shameless plug for Shopify. I also am a co-founder of an online e-learning platform for fitness trainers called Zona Fitness Academy. And I live in this tiny, tiny mountain town in the middle of nowhere, about an 8-hour drive from Vancouver in Canada. And I am a globe-trotting adrenaline junkie, so if you like sports, I am also a big fan. I play a lot of different sports: rock climbing, mountain biking, skiing, snowboarding, all the things. Anyways, so what are we here to talk about today? I'm going to start at a baseline to kind of make sure that I can bring everybody along during the entirety of this talk. There's a lot of content that I'm going through, and if it's confusing, feel free to ask me questions later. I'm happy to talk a little bit more extensively on it. So first, we're going to talk about the baseline of SVGs and what that means working with designers. So talking about things like project goals and how you can actually dive into the bones of the SVG when you're collaborating or exporting SVGs. And then we're going to start into the actual SVG beginner section. And then I will talk a little bit about my workflow, and then I'll start diving into these really amazing advanced SVG effects that you can utilize. So, okay, perfect. It looks great. I wasn't sure if the glow effect was actually going to work on there, but it did. So the screen resolution is excellent. So again, this is the same SVG that you saw previously. And one of the things that's really important when you're talking about larger scale SVGs and what you actually want to be doing with it, and the best question that I always ask is, do you want this to be a stagnant or an animated SVG? Because really it guides you down these 2 very different paths when you're utilizing SVGs in any project, especially within the web. And so one of the most important things you can do with your design team is communicate really early what you plan to do, whether that's on their side or on your side, right? You want to make sure that you both understand what you want the end result to be before you start even optimizing and exporting out those SVGs, because it will totally change the game on what you're able and capable of doing with the SVGs, depending on how your designer is going to be building them within Illustrator or Sketch. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about SVG assets and just give you a breakdown of what it looks like coming out of Sketch and Illustrator. I know most of you are not designers, but this is a really important thing to know so that you are helping your team to get the best knowledge possible. So there's a lot of amazing tutorials out there for exporting SVGs from Illustrator. I'm not going to go over it because, well, there's links in there so you can take a look at those. But I am going to dive into, oh, that's not good. Apparently my slide deck is not working. let's try that again. Okay. So when you are exporting an SVG from Sketch, that's what it looks like. I recognize on the left that this is Illustrator, but it kind of breaks it down. And this is a simple X. So imagine literally every single modal that you've ever built, they always have this there, almost always. And so this should actually be a really simple SVG component. But because Sketch is built on this infinite canvas, you will see that we have a transform attribute across the entire ecosystem. And what that does is it takes the SVG, when you export it from that infinite canvas, and it puts it wherever it is on the page, but then you have to apply all these transforms and translates to the actual SVG itself. And this looks pretty terrible, right? That's not a very readable piece of HTML. It's not something that I want to be utilizing. So how do we change that? How do we improve that? In Sketch, you can actually just ask your designers to input this single line into their terminal and then reboot their computer, and it will clean up the file quite a bit when they're doing export, but it still doesn't actually do it the best justice. The best way that you can do that is by exporting the SVG via its own artboard. Okay, and what that does is it takes something called the viewport, which is the box that actually contains the SVG itself, and it shrinks it down to what the actual size of this will be. And it will totally optimize that format. So as you go through it, you create its own artboard, you select the SVG layers itself, and then you can take and flatten it. And what this does is it takes and it merges all of the paths together to optimize the SVG down to its core pieces that you actually need for the pathway. There's like something going on with my slide deck, so I'm just gonna go to a different version of this. Okay, so when you take and export the file, it'll take it from this super messy piece of code and it'll convert it into the one on the left, on the right, and which is actually what we want to be happening because it's a little bit more readable. And so by taking those steps that I just walked through within Sketch, you get something that's a little bit cleaner and more readable to be utilizing. And so the pathway, the numbers and the letters define where this X is actually being sat, and this is the most optimized format that we want to be using because it'll allow us to do a lot more animations in the future. So just to recap, within your Sketch workflow, each of the layers of the groupings that you had seen on the previous slide, they translate to IDs. So each of the groupings that you see within there, they'll translate down into each of the IDs. And then you can take and name the layers accordingly. Wow, that's super small. Okay. So when we're looking at the SVG code itself, we actually want something, sorry, can you guys read that? Probably not, hey? It's okay. I'll go back to the original one and hopefully this will work this time. Okay, so when we're looking at SVGs for beginners, you can see that this code is quite complex to read and it's not super easy to understand. So we have things like the width and the height attributes that are defined by pixels right now. And you have a view box which defines the 33 by 33. So that's actually the box that contains that X item in there. Then you have the version of the SVG that it's pulling in. Then you have this random line piece of code from Sketch that actually is added from export when you export the code. That's not something that you need. You have these def tags, which I'll go over in a little bit. And then you have each of these lines or indentations of these groupings that you can see here. And each of these groupings are defined by the layers that were within Sketch or within Illustrator. And so this is actually part that we want to be reducing because you don't need all of that indentation and you don't need it to be going down even further through the parent. And so in the end, this is actually what we want it to be looking like. All this does is take the view box, which you always need to define on your SVG, and it just says, hey, I'm going to give you a 33 by 33 box. It is an infinite vector size that you can take and utilize no matter what, but these are the dimensions that I want. So what it's saying is that at the X and Y top coordinate is then the width and the height of the actual box that this X is being contained in. Because there's no pixel values, you don't need that, and that is what gives us that infinite size that is vectorized no matter how small or large you want that image to be. This is also a really, really small size, so from a web performance perspective, this is amazing. Then you go down a little bit further and you can see that we have a stroke 5 and our stroke 7. Those are just the different pieces of the X that are created with this closed modal box icon. So one of the things that is really important when you are working with your design team is from defining those goals, is the optimization. So optimization is really easy to do with icons. It's really easy to do with brand marks or logos. It's not super easy when you're doing something a little bit more complex. So those skull images that you saw before, it's not something that I would necessarily optimize. I would probably go into the Illustrator file myself and update the content a little bit more. So the challenge is that you have less control with these optimization tools that are available to you, especially with the more complex SVGs. I use SVGO for all of my icons or all of my simplified SVGs. And the reason why I use this is because it's a really easy tool. It'll take in, compress down all of the file sizes by quite a bit. I usually see anywhere from an 80 to 90% compression rate. Just based on the file size from SVGO, which is amazing. It just will take and do that. So you can have a global install of SVGO. You can also do this by folder, or you can target specific files that you want to optimize. I like using pretty because then I can still see the actual, the pretty attribute, because then I can actually see what the HTML should be looking like within your text editor. The other thing that's really important is because these SVGs are an infinite scale, you want to make sure that it's never going to go beyond the parent container that is within your browser. So you know how sometimes when you're scrolling through a browser, if someone forgot to add an image max width 100%, you'll scroll horizontally on your screen. You don't want that to be happening with your SVGs if it's not actually contained within a div element itself. And so if you add this default at the top of any of your CSS files, it'll give you that effect so that it doesn't actually bleed beyond the container within the browser, which is amazing. So you won't have any of those overflow problems that you're talking about. This is just something standard that I add as a fed no matter what. Okay, so let's talk about real life examples, because I can show you these crazy animations, but we don't really do a lot of that stuff very often. Well, this is something that's really similar. So the two examples that I want to give you is literally every single web page you ever build will always have these social icons available to you now, but you don't necessarily want to have to pull in that image every single time you load the page. The same thing goes for a brand mark. A brand mark is generally always on the header or in the footer of any site that you use. And so SVGs are pretty amazing because you can utilize something called a use tag. So what happens with that is you define the SVG once in the DOM, and you can utilize it everywhere. You can just take and call it with an ID, which is awesome, and this prevents duplication. And so in this context, for example, I have my brand mark that I want to be targeting that maybe I'm only utilizing the lightning bolt as opposed to the actual brand portion of the word mark portion of the brand mark. And so with that, I can take and call the entire piece of it. I can give a grouping of ID with the ID of lightning, and I can take and call just that. And this is as simple as it gets. It's super readable, and it's really nice to be able to do this. And you can do this across all of the things. You can apply things like fills, you can apply other styles to the SVG. That's just that portion of the SVG. And so I'm just going to pull up some code. Oops. So this is generally where I will define my icon set. So this is a super small React example. This is me defining every single one of the icons within here. And you can see I have the initial SVG definition. I have a width attribute on there, and then I have any other props that I want to be applying. I also have the view box, which is defined in there as well. And so by applying an ID that's specific to that pathway, so this path is just the Twitter icon, okay? And you take and define that throughout it. And what I do usually is I'll add it to my footer, and I'll apply a width of 0 to that specific SVG in the bottom of the DOM, and then I'll take and call it with the use element in a different area of the page, and then I can take and apply that across all of it. And so I have this single definition that's pulling in. And then I can take and define things like the URL. I can define whatever the platform is going to be, and then I can take and create a simple loop. So you can see here I'm calling my social icons component. That is just the image definition of that SVG. Then from there, if I want to create this listing that I want, I can take and pull in the rest of the SVG itself, and it's just utilizing the use function. I can apply an anchor tag so that it goes externally to other sites that I want it to be going to, and this can be applied literally with any SVG itself. So the same thing with those skulls. I define the pathway once on the page so that it is not, so that I don't have to like reload it every single time like you would have to do with a PNG. It's amazing, and it like really increases your web performance. So those are like some like small examples of how you can utilize it. And just to like recap from a project workflow, I always add IDs to every single one of my pathways and my groups of my icons so that I can pull them anywhere that I need to. It's not necessary every time, but that's part of it. I also do an icon dash or a logo dash prefix so that it's really easy to understand. And then one of the things that's really important that you do within your SVG is to remove the width and height attribute that has pixel definition. And the reason why you want to do that is so that you have this infinite unpixelated version of the brand or the logo or the icons or whatever the version of the SVG is that you're using. And it'll allow you to have that amazing, very crisp version of the images themselves. And then you can take and utilize them with the use element itself. And I generally always use svgo -- pretty on whatever the folder that's containing things like icons. So now we're going to get into the meat of the actual talk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the filters and the lighting effects, the ghost and blur. And for a few of you math nerds out there, there's some amazing cubic Bezier functions that you can add, which are excellent. There's key splines and K-naught values, and it's like, it makes my math heart just sing. Okay, so this is generally the breakdown of what I'm going to go over for the filters. So we're going to talk about the FE point light. We're going to talk a little bit about the FE composite item. Then I'm going to go through the ghost and blur, the spotlight, the offset, the specular lighting, and then the distant light. And these are all different SVG elements that you can apply within the definition element within the SVG. With me still, hopefully? Okay, so we're having another blank page. So this is the default pathway. So the initial definition of the SVG itself, not that one. So you can see in here, we have the initial SVG definition right here. Okay, so this is a really, really complex SVG, but this is the only time that I ever actually define the path of the SVG itself. And so what I did was I called it SVG badge with the ID so that I can pull it in. I'm taking and applying a fill color on this particular one, and this is how it creates that effect so that it's blue. By default, all SVGs are black. So if you don't actually define a color or a fill on the SVG itself, if you're like, why isn't this SVG showing up in my homepage or my browser? That could be a reason why. So let's talk about the point light. So the FE point light is literally what it says. It's the same as these particular spotlights that we have within the definition, and it defines where in the room, so we have a cube, imagine, it defines where in the room we actually are positioning that light that we want. Okay, so that gives us that initial definition. From there, I'm applying right here. So that's the point light. So what I'm saying is that in that cube, we're going to place it at an X of 60, we're going to place it at a Y of 69, and then a Z value of 100, okay? So we have this particular light where we're like going to be positioning it within the room that we're in. I am then taking and adding a specular lighting piece on top of that. And now what that specular lighting element does is it defines how wide or how narrow the light actually is that we're applying to the SVG itself. That's what actually gives us that amazing 3D kind of effect that you see within the initial element. Because you can see that this is like a very 2D, very specific SVG, and it doesn't actually have any effects on initially when we apply just a fill color to it. But when we take and position it within this 3D cube or this 3D room that we have, it gives it that offset or that effect that we're looking for. The other thing that I'm doing is that I'm applying an FE Gaussian blur to the actual image. Okay, so I'm going to walk through this kind of quickly. We have something called the FE composite element in here as well. So think of this effect as a number of layers that you're applying in the same way that you would do within Photoshop, within Illustrator, or as though you were making a sandwich, okay? So the first layer of this is applying a blur effect, and we're gonna call that result blur 1. With blur 1, we're taking and adding it into our specular lighting effect. We're gonna take and give that a new result, and we're gonna call it spec 1. Spec 1 is then going to go into the composite with the original source graphic. This is important. And we're going to take and apply all of those layers together, and that is what creates the end result. I'll talk a little bit about the operator function that this is referencing in a little bit, but that's kind of generally what you'll see within a lot of these effects. And so the FE composite just takes all of these layers and it merges it together. Okay, it doesn't matter how many effects that you apply, how many inputs or outputs that you want to be creating. You can do it infinitely if you really want to create those really amazing effects that you see. So I'm going to show you a code pen. So if I take out, you can see that we're applying this like one specific light. And the moment that I take out that composite, you can see that all it does is apply the specific light, and it's a little bit less, but we actually want to be seeing this to be a little bit more effective. And that's part of the reason why it does this for us. In that same instance, if we remove the light entirely, you can't actually see it because there's no original source graphic and there's no light. So all this is saying is that although I'm blurring the image, it's still just black. Okay? And again, if I take that actual light out, you'll still see the same effect, and it just goes black because all we have is a source graphic and there's not actually any input values there. Okay, so if anybody is interested in the math behind the operator function that we apply, there's two different formats that we can do. We can do the arithmetic, I'm not going to pronounce this right now. Arithmetic. It's still wrong. It's fine. But it takes and applies this math based on the numbers that you want to be seeing. So if you want to see some cooler effects, feel free, go nuts, go play a little bit more. So for some reason, this lighting effect is not actually working as much as what it did before. So I'm going to just pull it up in the browser and kind of go through the details. But essentially what's happening in here is I am applying a Gaussian blur. So I'm taking the original source graphic, I'm applying a blur effect on it, and I'm also animating that SVG effect. And so if we go in here, okay, it's big enough. So the actual definition is just applied within a filter effect. And so if I take these values and apply a much larger deviation, then you can see that the glow effect starts to get a little bit bigger. The other really cool thing with this too is if you noticed within the view box, I defined it a little bit larger with this particular SVG. And the reason I did that is because I don't want the glow effect to be hitting the outer limits of the box itself. I want the glow effect to be going well beyond the bounding boxes, but I still want it to have that same size. And so you can take and apply that in the same way. So if we break this down a little bit more, the standard deviation is how blurry I want that original image to be. Okay, so the higher the value, obviously, the more it'll take and apply that. Then I'm telling it to go from 0 to 7, okay? And I want it to be over the duration of 1 second, and I want that to happen indefinitely. And I want this to be a loop that starts at the bottom, goes up to the top, and comes back down, which is why I have that definition of 0, 10, 10, 0, because I want it to go all the way back up and back down so that it has a smooth effect and not like a very jittery piece of it. And then defining the key times and the key splines. So the key times associate with keyframes in the same way that you would see in CSS. And the key splines, those are defined within the cubic Bezier function that target each of the pieces of the matrices. And then I'm taking that blur effect, I'm giving it a result of spec 1, and then I'm taking that initial spec 1 and I'm inputting it into the source graph with the source graphic in those layers, and I'm adding them all together. So if I actually delete this element, you can see that it creates that blur effect, and it's like kind of weird, right? Like, why are we doing this? This is why we're creating that sandwich. It's that same instance. So it's blurring the actual image, but we want it to be, you still want the image to be visible. You still want it to be available so that it has that like really crisp, clean effect. This is why we layer everything on top in order to get to that next step. Okay. Talked about that. Okay, so this one is one of my favorite ones. So there's a few things that are happening here. It's quite complex. So not only am I telling this light to go off the screen, you can see on the left side of the image, it's not actually going beyond the bounding boxes of the SVG view box. It's going to the very edge. So I'm telling it to stop at 0. But on the other side of it, there's like a split-second moment where you don't see the SVG at all because there's no light effect that's being applied to it. And this is one of the amazing things that happens within the SVGs. And so I'm giving it an ID, so a filter. In that same instance that we're utilizing the use element, we're applying the ID or the filter effect. So you can have a single ID that applies all of these different effects within different versions of the filters. And you can take and apply that ID to the actual SVG itself through the use element within the SVG. Okay, so in this particular instance, I'm taking and applying a blur effect. With that blur effect, I'm inputting it into the specular lighting component. Now, I'm also taking that point light and I am telling it to be in that position in the box on a specific area of the screen. And I'm asking it to animate, but I only want it to be animating along the x-axis. I don't want it to be animating anywhere else. And so I'm telling it to go from a negative over the course of 4 seconds here, indefinitely. I'm telling it to go from -10, which is off the screen, to 100 to 170 to 200 to -10. Now, each of the key times are associated here in this particular instance. So in this item, I'm asking it to go a little bit quicker. And that's how you can see right now on the left of the image that it's going really, really fast. It's going off the screen momentarily, but then on the later half of it, it's like slowing down a little bit. Okay. So, browser support. Everybody's favorite part. So, I mean, SVGs have really exceptional browser support. The filters that I showed you, not as good. The filters are actually well supported across different browsers, but the one thing that is not super supported is that animate element that I showed you. However, there's this amazing library called GSoC or GreenSoC, which will allow you to utilize all of these elements, and it has it's available across different browsers. So you can still create these same effects. You just can't do it in Edge and IE. The bane of my existence, always when we're doing awesome things. It's coming. They're doing great work now. So SVGs are available everywhere now. There's no reason for you not to be using them anymore. They're much smaller. Web performance is amazing. And like, I don't really know what else to be telling you. I'm still blown away that people use PNGs and icon fonts for whatever reason. So SMIL is dead, according to IE and Edge. It's never going to get browser support, which is too bad. But you can utilize GreenSoC for this, or GSAP. So all of the animations that I showed you are available in CodePen in both the SMIL SVG format and the GSAP library format. So if you want to play around with them, feel free to grab it. Nobody here is a Ruby developer. Is anybody a Ruby developer? Yeah. This function is amazing for pulling in SVGs. So I highly recommend it. It's from a company called Thoughtbot. I found this years ago, but I still use it to this day to embed SVGs. It's awesome. Anyways, that's all I got. I have a lot of time for questions, so if anybody wants any questions, and there's additional resources on these slides as well. So thank you. Okay, everybody can go home. Thanks so much for coming. Yeah.
I think one strength of SVG over PNG is that you can more easily generate it. So if you have dynamic images where you find at runtime what they look like.
They're much faster. I mean, the file size is much smaller, right? Like there's so many different reasons to be using PNG versus SVG and vice versa, right? Like there's so many different image files that you can be utilizing. It really depends on what you want it to be doing, right? You didn't ask an actual question. You made a statement.
No, I mean when you have like a graph.
Yep.
And the data describes the graph, and you generate your source code creates the SVG because you don't know it's not static SVG. It's created by the program.
Oh yes. So you can. I'm going to try and paraphrase, but you can create dynamic SVGs within the browser itself. It doesn't actually have to be generated within Illustrator. You can take and manipulate the path letters and numbers that you see that are defined within there in order to have that effect as well. That's what you're saying? Exactly. Okay. Go ahead.
Are SVGs, the element within them, is this part of the DOM?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So your question was, are the SVG elements that are within the SVG, are they part of the DOM? Yes, they're totally part of the DOM. So I can actually pull that up. So all of these elements that you see here, so you have the initial definition that's defined within the SVG element. I am defining something called a filter with an ID of glow, and then I'm applying all of these effects. And then I'm taking and grabbing the actual pathway, which is identified as the SVG badge. So that is what is defining the path so that it knows where to grab the actual graphic. But you can take and apply all of these within the DOM. It looks very monochrome. I mean, it's, so the question was, is it just for logos? These are SVGs. So like you can create these effects no matter the case, right? Like these more complex shapes or paths, I would define them within Illustrator or Sketch. I wouldn't try and define this within the browser, but if you're doing something a little bit simple, like a circle or something like that, you can still define those right in the DOM itself if you want to build an SVG from scratch that way. Is that what you're referring to? Maybe, maybe not. You can come ask me later if you want to talk to me more. Go ahead.
I noticed that you inline the SVGs into the HTML view. Is that your personal choice? You always do that, or do you ever use the object tag or the image tag?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that you can pull in an SVG element into the DOM. You can reference it within a specific file. You can take and reference it in your CSS if you want. To get the maximum amount of benefit from it, I always put it directly in the DOM. And the reason why I do that is for speed from a loading perspective, for the ability to control the actual SVG, because you can't apply these fill effects unless the SVG is within the DOM itself. Sarah Sweden actually has an amazing amount of resources and content. Let's see if I can find her. So she has so many resources available. So if you are interested in reading more about SVGs, her and Sarah Drasner have an exceptional amount of content between their personal blogs and CSS tricks. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more in depth about each of those styles. She actually has a blog post that specifically talks about how to reference SVGs within your projects so that you can see the benefits across each of them. Any other questions? Okay. Hi. Sorry, what about animating the what? Oh, animating the path, yes. So you can animate the path. So remember when I was talking about how you can run SVGO on the actual element? If you do that, if you want to compress it down to the optimal state, it'll take and merge it into whatever the path is. So in Sketch or Illustrator, if you flatten the path, it'll give you that single pathway that was defined. Let me see if I can find it. So it'll give you that single pathway that's defined here. If you don't flatten it, and if you do something similar with the actual, in that original example that I had here, let's see if we can find this code. Okay, so you can take and animate each of these paths that are available here. So if you wanted to animate an X or a Y, you can take and apply an ID or a class, and then you can use CSS animation. You can utilize JavaScript in order to target each of these different unique pathways. So in this case, it's the X. So if you want to make that like fancy little circle, whatever, loop-de-loop with your X value on the modal window, you can do that. Right, that's part of the reason why these are so powerful, because you can take and change the way that the animations happen, whether it's the fill color or you're animating the path. So if you want to apply a transform, like a rotation function, this is part of the reason why you want to get to the SVG down to the very basics, is because if you have a transform or translate with this like really complex code, you can see in here we have all of this. So not only are you asking the DOM to take where the original transform translate is, you're also asking it to apply more effects. Does that make sense? Okay, go ahead. It's totally up to you. Right, so I will generally use one SVG to define all of my icons. So if I have something that's always going to be like very similar size that I want to be utilizing across the homepage, I'll define it once. So social icons, I always group them into a single SVG in that same format that I showed you in here. So I'll define it there, but if I have something that's only going to be on another homepage or like another page on within the actual website, then I'll define that in a different SVG itself and call it. In the same way that you would take and define a different image file accordingly. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. So the question, yeah. So the question was, what is the performance impact by adding animations within the SVG itself? I mean, it's like with anything. It depends on if you're applying CSS. It depends on if you're applying JavaScript. There's a lot of different variables or factors. You can apply a lot of the polyfills that are available for it. Libraries like GSAP or GreenSock will give you access to a pretty optimized format for that reason. But again, it depends on how complex the animation is, right? Like Sarah Drasner has some really amazing examples of the animations, and they work across multiple browsers and devices. Go ahead. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, do I have any experience with generating dynamic SVGs within a PDF report? No, okay. Yep. I mean, it would be the same as like printing any web page if you want to generate it as a PDF, right? I don't personally have any experience with what that looks like, but I don't see why you couldn't. Somebody else had a question? Go ahead. Yep. So you can definitely do that with things like JavaScript. GSAP is a great library again for that, to help you kind of target where it is. Like really the potential for SVGs. So the question was, the animations that I was creating were based on a linear track and they weren't dynamic. You can take and apply some pretty exceptional effects through that. Like again, let's see if I can find some of Sarah's stuff on here. Oh, that's... Apparently it's taking too long to load. So like, this is all SVG, right? That's pretty amazing. So there's a lot of things that you can do with SVG. I really encourage you to go and find Sarah Sweden and Sarah Drasner, because they do some, like the stuff that I showed you today is super simple compared to what is possible. Okay, I think I got time for one more question, if anybody has one. No? Awesome. Thank you so much.